The silver vase struck Clara West's cheekbone with a sickening crack that jolted her awake. Her vision exploded into stars as warm blood slid down her face. This wasn't emotional betrayal. It was physical, brutal, and immediate. She blinked through the blur to see her parents standing over her bed, champagne glasses in hand, their faces carved with disdain. "Serves you right for trying to upstage your sister," her mother, Evelyn, hissed, swirling her drink casually. "Let's see them photograph that face tomorrow." Clara's confusion tangled with pain. "What are you talking about?" she choked, tasting copper. Her father, Richard, chuckled as if she'd asked for a joke. "You should have stayed invisible," he sneered. "But no, you had to wear makeup, had to stand too close to the groom's mother." He leaned down, the smell of champagne sour on his breath. "You're nothing. Just the backdrop." Clara was 32, a quiet librarian who'd returned home for her sister's wedding weekend. Now her parents, the same people who once told bedtime stories and kissed her scraped knees, were toasting her humiliation. "To peace and perfection," Richard said, clinking his glass. "One less distraction," Evelyn added. Their silhouettes framed by hallway light looked almost elegant in their cruelty. Clara crawled toward the bathroom, vision spinning, locking the door behind her. When she flicked on the light, her reflection made her gasp. A deep crimson bruise bloomed across her face. A gash above her eyebrow bled freely. Her lips trembled, but no tears came. That terrified her most. She didn't feel pain or fear, only a chilling emptiness. Morning arrived with a pounding on the bathroom door. "Don't you dare ruin this day." Isabella's voice pierced through the wood, sharp and furious. Evelyn's voice followed, cold and clipped. "You come out and wear the gray dress we picked, or leave." Clara opened the door slowly. The three of them stood there, her sister in silk robes and curlers, her parents flanking her like royal guards. Isabella recoiled. "Oh my God, Clara. What did you do to yourself?" Before she could answer, Evelyn snapped. "She probably fell. She's always been clumsy." Then she leaned close, whispering, "And no one will believe you over us." She shoved a concealer stick into Clara's hand. Clara said nothing, just looked at the family she'd once adored and realized they were strangers now. An hour later, Clara stood at the back of St. Andrew's Church, her face a patchwork of bruises and makeup. Guests turned to stare, some curious, others judgmental. No one asked what had happened. Evelyn leaned close during the vows and hissed, "Smile. At least pretend to be useful." Richard chuckled, his voice dripping with pride. "She's lucky we even let her attend." The words sliced deeper than any wound. Clara's heart hardened, her thoughts turning sharp and still. That was the moment something inside her cracked, not broke, but sliced open with precision. They believed she'd stay silent. They didn't know she'd just begun to think differently. The next morning, sunlight streamed through thin curtains, stabbing at Clara's swollen eye. She winced as she sat up, each pulse of her heartbeat sending pain through her face. Downstairs, laughter floated from the kitchen. "Big day for our perfect daughter." Richard's booming voice echoed. "Nothing could ruin it," Evelyn replied sweetly. Isabella's giggle followed. Clara sat frozen. The anger came slowly, first disbelief, then confusion, then a cold clarity that numbed her completely. She stood, washed her face with icy water, and tied a scarf over her bruises. As she stepped into the kitchen, Evelyn gasped theatrically. "Clara, what happened to your face?" she cried for the caterer's benefit. Richard smirked. "Maybe clumsiness runs in the family." Clara wanted to scream the truth, to grab the shattered vase and slam it on the table. But she didn't. She'd learned long ago how easily her parents rewrote stories. Every bruise, every tear became attention-seeking. So she watched quietly. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she passed sugar. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Isabella's laughter sounded forced. Clara realized something. These people lived off pretending. Their piece was a script, and she was done playing her role. At the lakeside wedding venue, crystal chandeliers shimmered over white roses. Isabella glowed in her designer gown, walking arm in arm with Richard, the same man who'd nearly broken Clara's nose 12 hours earlier. Evelyn followed, whispering to guests, "Both my girls look radiant today." Clara stood in the shadows, her bruises hidden by foundation and dim light. The guests offered pitying glances, assuming jealousy or clumsiness. No one asked. No one ever did. Clara realized that silence was her family's favorite weapon, and she was about to use it back on them. During the toasts, Isabella's new husband raised his glass. "To the most beautiful woman I've ever met," he declared. Guests clapped. Richard joined, smirking at Clara. "To family," he said. "Even the ones who try not to ruin photos." Laughter rippled. Evelyn leaned toward her friends. She used to be pretty, before she let herself go. Always jealous. The mockery spread like poison. Clara's phone buzzed. It was Naomi Clark, her coworker. "Are you okay?" she texted. Clara replied, "Not yet. But soon." The rest of the reception passed like a fog. Clara drifted from table to table, memorizing faces, words, gestures. Every cruel smile, every whispered lie burned itself into her memory. When the music swelled and her parents danced, champagne glasses raised, she realized they'd built their lives on one fragile thing: image. Appearances were their religion, perfection their god. And she had finally found the one thing that could destroy them: truth. When the guests began leaving, Clara slipped quietly into the bride's suite. On the vanity, Isabella's phone sat unlocked beside her perfume. One swipe revealed hundreds of messages, flirty texts between Isabella and the wedding planner, incriminating photos from before the ceremony. Clara took photos of everything. Then, from Richard's unlocked jacket pocket, she found his phone, emails about bribes and fake donations. On Evelyn's tablet, she found the cruelest secret of all: charity emails begging relatives for money to help her sick, unemployed daughter Clara. Evelyn had used her image to scam people for years. Clara copied it all, calm, methodical, unstoppable. By the time the wedding ended, Clara had collected more evidence than she could have imagined. That night, the house glowed with laughter and champagne. Her parents and sister toasted in the living room, pretending nothing had happened. "To perfection," Evelyn declared. "To success," Richard added. Isabella smirked. "And to keeping trouble quiet." Clara stood in the doorway, half hidden by shadows, her face still swollen beneath the dim lamp. "You can smile now, sweetheart," Richard teased. Evelyn raised her glass toward her. "At least you didn't ruin anything." Isabella chuckled. "Guess that vase finally taught you to stay in your place." Clara smiled, calmly, eerily. None of them knew what she'd already set in motion. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Pain pulsed through her face, but it was the memory of their laughter that kept her awake. She sat by the window, the moonlight pale on her bruised skin. On the desk beside her laptop, 3 folders waited, one for each of them. Years of being the silent one had taught her how to move quietly, how to stay unseen until the right moment. Now, she used that skill like a weapon. With practiced precision, she drafted 3 anonymous emails, each filled with attachments and screenshots. Her fingers didn't tremble once. At 5 in the morning, Clara slipped out of bed. The house smelled of stale perfume and alcohol. Champagne glasses were scattered across the coffee table. Wilted roses lay crushed underfoot. Her parents were passed out on the couch, still in their wedding clothes. Isabella snored softly in the armchair, her perfect curls undone. Clara stood silently in the doorway, taking in the sight. "You thought I'd stay small," she whispered to herself. "You thought I'd disappear." Her bruised reflection glimmered faintly in the window pane. She didn't feel hatred anymore, just a strange, icy peace. Her years at the library had given her quiet but powerful skills. She'd learned how to trace metadata, protect privacy, and schedule delayed sends. Using those same skills, she'd already created 3 hidden email accounts. The first was addressed to Richard's biggest clients, each message containing copies of his fake invoices and payment records. The second went to Evelyn's charity donors, complete with her fraudulent fundraising emails and the photos she'd used of Clara. The last went to Isabella's new in-laws, carrying screenshots of her late-night texts with the wedding planner. Clara didn't send them yet. She scheduled them for 9 a.m. sharp. When she returned upstairs, the early light was just beginning to creep through the curtains. Clara's cheek throbbed with each heartbeat, but she didn't bother to hide it anymore. Pain was temporary. Truth was permanent. She glanced at the clock. 8:30 a.m. time to go. She packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, her clothes, her laptop, her son's drawing of a sunflower, and her grandmother's Bible. Everything else could rot in that house. She tiptoed into her son's room. Ethan stirred as she touched his shoulder. "Mom," he murmured, blinking. "Time to go, sweetheart," she whispered. "Where?" he asked softly, voice still thick with sleep. "Somewhere warm," she said, forcing a smile. "Somewhere people don't lie." Ethan nodded without question. He trusted her completely. The same trust her parents had shattered, she would rebuild for him. They slipped out quietly before anyone else stirred. The morning air bit cold against Clara's face, but it felt cleaner than it ever had. She and Ethan walked down the empty street toward the bus stop. The rising sun painted gold over the rooftops, like the world was being rewritten. At exactly 9 o'clock, Clara's phone vibrated. Once. Twice. Then non-stop. Notifications flooded in: emails, calls, messages. Her plan had begun. She didn't open them. She didn't need to. She simply held Ethan's hand and said softly, "It's over now." By noon, the quiet storm she'd unleashed had torn through their lives. Richard's company phones were exploding with calls. One of his clients had leaked the payment threads online. Local journalists picked it up within hours. Evelyn's Helping Hands Foundation website went dark by afternoon after donors shared screenshots of her fraudulent letters. One caption spread like wildfire. She used her own daughter's suffering for money. Isabella's life unraveled fastest. Her husband's family confronted her before dinner. The screenshots spoke for themselves. The honeymoon was canceled. Her reputation shattered. That evening, Clara sat on a park bench outside the small hotel she'd booked. She held her phone, watching messages pour in, calls from unknown numbers, her father's name flashing again and again. She didn't answer any of them. Then one message appeared. "You think this fixes anything?" It was from Richard. She stared at the words for a long moment, then typed slowly, "No. It just shows what was already broken." Then she powered off her phone and exhaled. Days turned into weeks. Clara and Ethan stayed at the hotel until she found a small apartment above a bakery downtown. The owner, Grace Miller, was a kind woman she'd met months earlier during a library outreach program. When Clara called asking for help, Grace didn't ask questions. She simply said, "Come. The couch is yours." That night, for the first time in years, Clara slept without fear of being woken by shouting or thrown objects. The silence felt like healing. A month later, Clara decided not to return to the library. She resigned quietly and began helping Grace manage the bakery's books. "You're good with details," Grace said one morning as they arranged pastries. "People like you make the world make sense." Clara smiled faintly. "People like me used to think being invisible was safer." Grace looked at her kindly. "Sometimes invisibility is strength, until you decide to be seen." The words stayed with her for days. Ethan adjusted quickly to their new life. He started school nearby and made a friend named Leo. One afternoon, he came home holding a drawing, two figures under a bright yellow sun. "That's us," he said proudly. "I made you look happy this time." Clara laughed, really laughed. "You did," she whispered, hugging him tight. It was the first time laughter didn't hurt. 2 months later, an envelope arrived at the bakery addressed to Clara. No return name, just her address in tidy handwriting. Inside was a photograph, Evelyn and Richard sitting in their once grand living room, now half empty, furniture gone, auction signs visible through the window. Isabella sat beside them, mascara streaking her face. Scrawled across the bottom in Evelyn's handwriting were 5 words. "Are you happy now, Clara?" She looked at it for a long moment, then pinned it to the refrigerator. Not out of spite, but as a reminder of everything she'd survived. Happiness isn't watching them fall, she told Grace later that evening. It's knowing they can't hurt me anymore. Grace nodded. That's the kind that lasts. Together, they closed the bakery for the night. Clara stood by the window, watching rain streak the glass. For the first time, she didn't feel like the invisible daughter. She felt like someone new, someone rebuilding herself piece by piece. Weeks passed, and Clara began noticing small changes. She smiled more. She no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. She found peace in simple things, kneading dough, counting coins, wiping flour from the counter. Grace often joked, "You're the calmest storm I've ever met." Clara laughed softly. Maybe because I already lived through the hurricane. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Grace found Clara sitting on the porch steps, staring at the fading horizon. "You ever think you went too far?" Grace asked gently. Clara shook her head.
No.
"I think I finally went far enough." Grace smiled faintly.
Good.
"Just don't look back too long. Even revenge loses its shine if you stare at it." Clara nodded, her hand brushing the faint scar on her cheek. "It doesn't scare me anymore," she said. "It reminds me that I survived." A year later, Clara opened her own cafe, a small space painted soft cream and gold, filled with sunlight and quiet music. She named it Glass and Grace. When customers asked about the name, she'd smile and say, "Because both can break, but only one reflects light afterward." The cafe soon became a local favorite. People came not just for the pastries, but for the peace that seemed to fill the air. Ethan often sat near the window doing homework while Clara served customers. Sometimes he'd glance up and smile at her, and she'd think, this is what love looks like. Simple, steady, unshakable. She'd traded chaos for calm and found herself again in the process. Each morning, as she unlocked the cafe doors, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not for revenge, but for release. Occasionally, Clara still saw her parents' names in the newspaper. Small headlines about ongoing investigations, unpaid fines, and bankruptcy hearings. Each time she saw them, she felt nothing, not hatred, not triumph, just closure. They had destroyed themselves. She had simply held up the mirror. Isabella's downfall was quieter but permanent. Her husband annulled the marriage. The friends who'd once envied her stopped calling. She moved back in with their parents, all of them clinging to the remnants of a reputation already in ashes. Once, Clara saw a message request from Isabella online. 3 words. "You were right." Clara deleted it without reading further. By the next spring, Glass and Grace flourished. Grace helped Clara train new staff, and local artists began displaying their work in the cafe. One evening, a customer pointed to the framed photo behind the counter, a landscape of sunlight breaking through shattered glass. "That's beautiful," he said. Clara smiled. "It's not broken glass," she replied. "It's reflection." Life moved forward softly but surely. Ethan turned 10 and asked if they could adopt a stray cat that often lingered near the bakery. "He looks lonely," he said. Clara smiled. "Then he'll fit right in." They named him Comet. That night, as Ethan fell asleep, Clara realized the house finally felt like a home. On the anniversary of the wedding, Clara baked a single vanilla cake. She placed 3 candles on top, one for truth, one for peace, and one for freedom. She didn't light them for revenge. She lit them for the girl she used to be, the one who stayed silent too long. "You're safe now," she whispered to her reflection. "You made it." Months later, Grace found Clara gazing at a framed quote she'd hung by the door. It read, "They used to toast to perfection. I toast to imperfection and truth." Grace grinned. Still poetic, even after everything. Clara laughed. Especially after everything. The scar on her cheek caught the afternoon light, glimmering faintly like a badge. Years later, when people asked about her story, Clara never spoke of the vase or the bruises. She simply said, "I used to be the backdrop in someone else's picture. Now I take my own." Her cafe thrived, her son grew strong, and peace became her quiet revolution. The West family's empire had collapsed, but Clara's strength endured. They'd shattered the mirror once, but she was the one holding it steady in the end.